Well, hello and welcome in. This is a little bit different than anything I've ever done. We've had a few minor issues with the audio back where we've been recording in our back classroom. And so here today, for you guys that have watched week one of our Young Families class on the home, that obviously is not going to look like you're seeing today, but figured the best route to take rather than try to figure all that out and stuff I don't know about is just to kind of sit here in front of the screen and record and take you through really the things that we talked about yesterday in our Young Families class on the home. So glad that you're joining us. If you weren't with us last week for week one, we began by really just trying to lay some foundational pieces to everything that we're going to talk about this quarter with this word on the screen, home. And we talked through really why we should be the kind of people that place a premium on the home and make it a priority and what happens within the family unit. And really, for the most part, we kind of left off in this spot where we were talking through really what you see here on the screen. What starts at the home changes the world. And we looked at some Bible stories where this is true. We had someone mention Moses, someone mentioned Noah. And we talked a little bit about Timothy and his mother and his grandmother that's mentioned, as well as the other big one that I pointed us to from Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, and why God chose Abraham in the first place. And then some of what we looked at and what we discussed last week, as it relates to the home and going back to a place is how God has always placed a priority and a premium on the home and always wanted something special inside of the home. We read through Deuteronomy chapter 6, most especially what we as young families should be doing in teaching diligently to our sons and to our daughters and to our kids, or maybe it's your grandkids, and talking about all the good and the great things that God has done. But with that also comes the reality of the other side, the very real possibility of something that did happen that we learn of in Judges 2, and the very real possibility that this could be something that happens over a long period of time. We talked about how Satan likes to play the long game, right? And so part of what we see here in Judges 2, certainly after some time had passed, and what we see here is that there's a generation that arose that did not know the Lord nor the work that he had done for Israel. That's a scary thing, which kind of led into the sharing of this. And I told you guys I stole this from Dan Cheney, who posted it on Facebook a few months ago. And we talked about the reality of this. And I'm not sure I can sit here and specifically clump everyone into one category or another. But really, a lot of what we're talking about in this class is what is the trajectory of your home and what does it look like based on your family? We weren't all raised the same. We all didn't grow up with the same parents. And so, what you see here on the screen can hit you a little bit different based on the way you were raised or the way that you weren't raised. And so in some cases, your parents did exactly what your grandparents did. And now you're just trying to recreate that in your home. In some cases, you didn't have either of these two. You didn't have grandparents that were faithful, parents that were faithful, and now you by yourself as a single or you as a married couple, you're trying your best to do the very thing that you know was missing in your life. And so the question for us is, which side of this Deuteronomy 6 or Joshua 2 trajectory are you and your home and your family and your marriage on? And so what we talked about to start this week is how, like, that's the question that needs to be constantly evaluated and considered and reflected on by us that are leading the home and guiding the home and having the biggest impact on the home. And so I told you last week that we were going to get into today really what homes are. And I shared with the class. I hate to move away for a second, but most of this stuff comes from this book called Homes Are, written by Jacob Hudgens, and so most of the things that we're going to try to follow, obviously with my own modifications to fit us here at Central. Most of the things that will be our talking points will come from this book. And so the first thing that we looked at is really that homes are habit incubators. And so I shared that over the years, and maybe it's true of you as well. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, Jed, you sounded just like your dad when you said that, or you reminded me of your mom when you did this or that. Like we get that part. What we learn inside of the home, what we learn in our marriages, what we see from our parents, what our kids learn from us, it all becomes very habitual because home is the place, as we talked about last week, where we spend the most amount of time. We spend a lot of time there. We spend time there with other people. And so homes, as you see here on the screen, are habit incubators. And so we talked about that word incubators. We know the word habit. Incubator is nothing more than it was described in class. Someone answered that it's a warm and cozy place, right? And it can be that in order for something to grow and for something to mature, something to be nurtured. And that's a lot of what the home is an incubator. But put inside the context of a habit incubator, I pose some questions for your reflection. So, what does yours look like? What is cooking inside of your home? What's growing there? And is it the right temperature for good habits to grow in our kids, in your marriage, you individually, with your spouse? And then for that to not just grow, into something good, but also to go out and to be spread. So, another thing we talked about that was brought up in week one was this passage in Proverbs chapter 22. And we'll talk about that in a second. But, so much of the home, as we discussed, is like, especially with young kids that are at that really, I guess, stage in their life where they can be molded and they can be shaped. We talked about how, teachers that are in elementary education, how they play such a huge role in the development of a child, but not more so than the parents that have those kids at that age. So we talked about some of that. And we do have, situations as you read this passage here on the screen, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it. And we see that, but that's not always entirely true, right? And we know that. Like, we know, or you can probably think of some instances or scenarios or people where the parents raised this child right and they did the best they could and they had them at church and they did everything they could to give that kid a good trajectory to be on when he left the home. And then that child goes out and he throws mud all over it and he just makes a mess of things, right? We know that to be true, where a kid can turn and do a complete 180. But more times than not, in the context of this habit incubators and homes being that, statistics say that about 90% of the time, when kids leave the home, they're going to do what's been warm and cozy and comfortable and has grown from the time that they were a child. And they're just going to go out and they're going to recreate that in their own lives. And so obviously Proverbs 22 is a good place to look at in regards to this. Again, train up a child and the way he should go, even when he's old, he will not depart from it. Now, again, is that a guarantee? No, it's not. And that was brought up last week in week one. We can think of those situations where this on the screen is not entirely true. But we also need to notice that it says, even when he's old, he will not depart from it. Like, to give great amount of consideration to that, it should cause you to think or maybe think of some situations where, yeah, maybe one went out and made a mess of things, but then way on down the road, that child comes back, right? And we don't know why they messed it up. We don't know why they, threw mud all over it and made a wreck of it. But what's so important in this passage for us to understand is the foundation that we're building. And the foundation that we're building, most especially in our homes and with our kids, and building a firm foundation that even if they're in that 10% that go out and make a mess of things, that eventually that foundational nurturing or growth can come back to them. And that we talked a little bit about how that reminds us in our class this week of Luke 15 and the story of the prodigal son. We're not sure how he was raised, that prodigal son. We know how the father treated his son upon his return when he came back. So I think that in that we could make some assumptions about that story, that the boy was raised right and he was trained up right, and yet he goes out and makes a mess of everything, throws mud all over it, only to wake up inside a pig pen and realize I got to go back where? I'm going to go back home. I'm going to go back home to my father. And there's a lot of application in that, that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in. But I also posed to the class this that we typically not to change scripture, alter scripture here, but pose to them this, like train up a child in the way you choose, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it. I think it's super important to continue to consider both sides of this equation, like we did Deuteronomy 6 and Judges 2. We typically think of Proverbs 22 in regards to the good and the things that we're building in the home and training in the home, so that child should know the way that they should go. But the other side of it is that, honestly, it's up to you. It's up to us, because sometimes we can train up a child in the way that I choose, and I'm training them up the wrong way to be selfish or to be hypocritical or that God comes behind more important things. So if we train them that way, then what do we expect will be the result, right? And so if just 10-ish% of the time it's that a child goes out and they do the complete opposite of everything I've taught them or learned them or trained them, especially in regards to the faith, then what? What should we expect? Well, that they're going to hang on to their faith. And so we got to make sure that we aren't training them or putting them in a position to fight a really bad trajectory in regards to keeping the faith when they leave the home. And so the other part of this is that, we can't be surprised if our kids choose the way we don't want them to go, because our actions inside of the home spoke a lot louder than maybe just the things that we said, which kind of leads into another point here in a minute. So the next part that we looked at is that homes are growth engines. We looked at and we talked about how, yeah, no duh, kids naturally just grow, and that's something that happens. But hopefully we give a great amount of consideration to that, in their growth spiritually and our growth in our marriages and with all the relationships that make up a family, that it requires a lot of patience and a lot of consistency. And then on top of that, if you know and you have kids, it goes by really fast. And so growth from a physical standpoint, again, is not necessarily what we're talking about here. More so spiritually, like to look inside the home and to say, okay, who's growing, who's not growing. And, so we talked about here, this is really important that when it comes to growth and, especially inside of a family where you're all together, I hope this little arrow shows up on your screen. But we talked about, realistically, when it comes to growth and a trajectory, like when we look inside the home, typically I think of maybe my wife and my kids and their growth, and I say that I'm going to measure their growth by this line. And I know that I'm not showing you a line on the screen, but what starts down should steady go up and to the right. And I don't like to hear this much, but if that's what I expect from them, then what does it look like for me? And it's interesting, as we talked about in our class yesterday, that sometimes we expect everyone else inside the home to grow, but we don't expect ourselves to grow. And then on top of that, we all know that growth does not look like this when it comes to relationships, when it comes to our marriages, when it comes to our kids, but rather more so than anything, it's more of an up and down kind of thing. So just some parts of reflection here, I guess, inside your home would be to ask, okay, who in your home is not growing? And the first place that you need to start is with you. And then, if it's us and you're married, it's okay, who in the home is not growing? Is it us? Is it me and my wife Megan? And then is it our kids? And so everyone in the home needs to be working towards some positive change, husband and wife, singles, parents, kids, and most especially, as I mentioned before, when it comes to our kids, there should be some growth. And so I'm going to skip through just a little bit and take you to the next part over here on the screen. There we go. And that is, we also talked through, the idea that homes can be hypocrisy revealers. And so the really important question I think that I asked for us to consider with this one is, which version of you is the real you? Or if you're married, which version of us, me and Megan, is the real us? Because sometimes we can get into a habit, there's that word, where we're not growing, but it looks like from the outside to everyone else as though we've got it all figured out and we are growing. And so I would say in this, what we need to consider is, again, which version of us is the real us? I think we've all been in the position before where maybe, we've dressed up and we've played church and we bring the kids and everybody looks good and we're all fine. But is that the reality of where we're at and who we are? And if it's not, then it can become a very dangerous thing to be that kind of a person, or that kind of a family and that kind of a home. It can be very dangerous because to the family, most especially to our kids that can see right through it, church, being with the church, studying our Bibles, doing all these things to set us on the right trajectory forward becomes just another external exercise to be clumped right in with baseball games and going out to eat, where we just dress up or dress however and we go. It's just one more thing. And our kids are going to pick up on that. So I don't know about y'all, and where you are, but I was talking to our class yesterday. Megan and I spend a really healthy amount of time just talking to the girls, and I wouldn't necessarily call it lecturing, because we've tried to always keep a very open dialogue with them and just talk. And more than anything, try to provide a safe space for them to come to us and to talk, which we'll talk about next week. But if your family is built that way, then I just wonder sometimes if maybe the things that I'm talking to my kids about or lecturing them on turn out to really mean nothing because of what they see in me, or what they see in us, and that not match what it is that we're saying. So that can be very telling of the home, as a hypocrisy revealer. And so, like, what we say matters. It needs to be me. It needs to be us in the case of a marriage, if you have a spouse, and it needs to match how I live. And so, as we consider the Bible, our class got to talking about the Pharisees and religious leaders, and all throughout the Bible, they're talked about as being hypocritical, which falls in line with what we're talking about here, and why they were being called out as being hypocrites because they're saying one thing, they're teaching one thing, but then they're going out and they're doing the complete opposite. And Jesus saw right through that, right? Matthew chapter 15, beginning there in verse 8, is a big passage, I would say, that's very telling of what we're talking about right here. As Jesus says of these guys, they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. And so, if the example is not there, but the lecture is there and my words are there, then what, right? Like we know how that feels. Maybe you've seen that in the home, or maybe it's happened with you already if you're a parent. Now, um, if we move into this last piece that we talked about, and again, I'm just kind of summarizing everything we looked at last week. The last piece is this, that homes feed society, or they're feeders of society. And a lot of what we talked about right here was Aquila and Priscilla, who we studied a few weeks ago in our Power of One series. And I'm not sure if y'all remember that, but their story is a super powerful one, an amazing example of a couple that we can point to in Scripture, and they moved all over the place. And the church was meeting in their home wherever they were and wherever they went, and they're commended for their faith. But we looked at the power of the home, just one home in their example a few weeks ago. And we made the point that, we too can have Christian homes, even though what's around us might be bad for them. It was living in Corinth, and we talked about how bad it was then, how bad it is for us today where we live. It's bad. It's bad there. It's bad there. Around every corner is immorality and wickedness. And yet, as we look at Aquila and Priscilla, they maintained a Christian home. And so, how cool is it that one home, your home, I hope, my home, I hope, can have an impact and can feed society? Like it was brought up last week how just one Christian home can reach others, and maybe examples of that. Um, but like, let me go here, I guess, as I continue to summarize and wrap this up. Um, I started to think about this season of 2024 we're in, like we just had an election, and like there isn't anyone that I've heard that is talking in the positive way about this country, right? Like our country is falling apart. Our country is in shambles, a lot of finger pointing as to whose fault that is. And so, as we consider us in the home, it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do about it? Like, am I just going to cast my one vote? Am I going to continue to post on social media and then complain? And that's it. You see, the idea here with this point, homes being a feeder of society, is that, the best way to change something, and I'm not bashing voting or posting on social media, but I'm just saying sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the most amount of control that we have is right there inside that family unit, making the biggest impact on what's going to eventually feed society, and therefore, in turn, help out our country and the next generation. So let me end with where we started, that what starts at the home changes the world. As goes the home, so goes everything else. And I think an application to this point is really, or all of these points, I should say, is just to check on and reflect on and give a great amount of consideration to the trajectory that you and your home or your family unit is on. And so next week, we're going to talk through really what is home, and talk about most especially homes being a safe place, and all the points that go into making the home a safe place. So hopefully we'll see you next week on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Back here at Central in classroom A1. Look forward to seeing you guys then.